Hey, what's good, family? Welcome back to another video, which is brought to you by Kilohearts. They've been so kind to send me a copy of all their stuff in order for me to be able to do some videos over it, which I'm really excited to do. And I'm happy to introduce the very first patch that I've made from Phaseplant and Multipass, which sounds like this. So if you're interested in figuring out how this bass is made, then stick around for a bit and I will show you how. Now, before I go into this any further, I kind of just want to mention that I'm not really going to talk about the specific effects other than the disperser whenever we get to it, because that's going to be the most confusing. For now, I just kind of want you to look at the setup and the overall design about how I go about making these kinds of basses, as opposed to looking at the exact parameters, because otherwise it's going to take me an hour to get through this entire thing. But if we kind of have an idea of the first part is understanding the processing chain or the signal root of effects, distortion, EQ, and filtering. It doesn't really matter the order, but just taking those in mind, then we can kind of have a basis or a foundation which to go off of. And then when we get to the multipass, which is a frequency split effects chain, we'll kind of talk about the methodology behind that. Actually, let's do that now. So as far as effects goes, that's your processing chain. EQ, effects, distortion, filtering. But as far as where to apply that, if you look at here are sub-frequencies. That's relatively, untouched, other than the stereo is being here and then some very light compression is happening. The mids is generally where you do the most creative effects to. That's kind of where you try to do all of your crazy modulation and, crazy filtering, chorus, and all that stuff. And then generally, as far as my practice goes, I try to introduce the most stereo onto the high end. So you'll see that here. And we'll get into more so of that later down the road. But again, I kind of just want to set up the frame in order for me to be efficient with this really long patch. Because this video isn't so much about how everything works in here. It's just more so about what I did. So with all that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. All right. So here we have just about everything. And if I turn all of these off, let's go ahead and just listen to what we have at the very beginning. So we have two groups. One of them is a sub, and then one of them is the processing chain. The processing chain is going through the effects, and then the sub itself is on its own output. So, oh crap, let me turn all this other stuff off. So here we have a wavetable, and I've kind of set a macro onto the frame, which we're starting from 91, and that's just a means of changing the source to something else if I so choose. Now on the Unison, there is 3 voices with a spread of here, the detune is here, the blend is all the way up, and that's pretty much it for that. I've added a distortion modulator, which is, this is feeding into the distortion unit now, and that's just kind of beefing it up a bit. This wavetable thing in particular, we can actually close that out because I'm not really using that, is being fed into a filter, which is a bandpass that is on this LFO. And on here, I've kind of just drawn in these points, which is really cool because it's a lot like Serum, except that everything can kind of line up to the grid. You can turn that off with the magnet. So that's a really awesome function. Thank you, Kilohearts. Other than that, that's pretty much it. That's going into the output, and then that goes into the effects. So that's the processing chain. On the sub, it's literally just a sine wave that is going to the master. So that's also really cool that you can choose where to send that, and that makes things really easy, especially if you're trying to split up your bands, so to speak. Now, this is kind of, in a sense, a means of, it's not so much frequency splitting, it's more so of a signal split, but all of my harmonic content is being through the processing group, and then I'm kind of keeping my sub on its own kind of nice and tidy, and that's kind of why I've chosen to do that. On to the effects. There are 3 lanes, but the 3rd lane isn't really being used for anything other than I can use a slice EQ as a visualizer. So it's kind of cool if I play this. Oh, actually, let me turn these off. Then I'm kind of able to see, not necessarily meticulously, but I can kind of just have a general overview about what I'm looking at. So let's go ahead and start with lane 1, and then we can kind of just go on from there. I'll turn everything off, and then we can go through these one by one. And again, just for the sake of time, I'm not going to talk about all these and what I've done and whatever, just kind of keep a note the order of effects that I'm doing, because it's kind of arbitrary. And literally it's just kind of like listen to how it sounds. So yeah. So the first thing I did was added some Q. I am boosting the mids ever so slightly and boosting the highs. The disperser we will talk about later, but it is an all pass filter, and I'm playing that at my root note. You can't really tell the difference. You might not be able to tell the difference until you get to the last stage, but just kind of keep that one in mind. We have some phase distortion that looks like this. I think that makes it a little bit meaner. Then we have some more saturation that is not really doing a whole lot, but it's adding a little bit of fuzz. You can hear it clicking, so you know that's doing a little bit, but it's not really a big difference. Then we have our notch filter. If I have any kind of modulation going on, or sorry, automation, it's all going to the same LFO. So that's just kind of how I do things. It makes it a lot easier for me. Next up, we have some distortion that is on saturate. And again, I didn't really like choose one over the other. It was more so of just like what I liked or how it sounded. So don't really worry so much about having to copy these effects exactly, unless if you're trying to replicate the patch. But as a means, what I did was balance the sound out a little bit, add some interesting effects and some distortion, then give it a little bit of filtering. So, and then added some distortion to kind of bring back the frequencies that I'm cutting out. So it's not really like all of these are really important in any particular order. So lane 1 is feeding into lane 2, where we start off with another EQ. I'm taking out some of the lows, then, oh, let me turn these off, sorry. So here's our EQ. Again, not a big difference. Some more saturator. That's going to add some more fuzz. Then we have our phaser. The rate is set to really slow and the depth isn't that big, but it's just going to give a little bit more movement. And then we have a resonator, which is pretty cool. This is set to the root note that I'm playing at, which is in between F and D sharp. So right now it's on D sharp, and that is just going to give it some extra high end. And you can set this to whatever note you want, but it's kind of cool because if I turn the mix all the way up, that gives it just a little bit more of that higher crunchy end. And you can set it to either a saw or a square. The compressor is next to try to balance the sound out or make everything flat. And then finally on lane 3, there's not actually anything happening other than this visual. And if you want to do something fun, then you can turn a transgate on and create an arpeggiator out of it, which is kind of cool, but we're just going to leave that off. So this is pretty much it for the patch and Phaseplant. We are going to return to this particular thing, and then I didn't really talk about the FM capabilities, but they're there that I might cover in a different video. Just kind of keep that in mind, but yeah, we'll come back to it. All right, so the multipass is next, and this is so cool because if you don't know a lot about frequency splitting, this is like the best way to introduce yourself to it. You can create this in Ableton and just about any other DAW as well. Ableton is a little bit easier with the way that groups work, but if you're doing this in something like FL Studio or Cubase, then when you're first learning, it can be very difficult to just figure all this out. Because what we have set up here is a pre-effects, which is it affects the entire sound before it goes through here. Then we have our band split, which we can apply effects to any band that's in between below 250 hertz, between 250 hertz and 3K, and then over 3000 hertz. And then we have a post effects, which will apply effects to everything after this whole chain. And that's just a really cool signal process, or just it's a great way to visualize how frequency splitting works in a nutshell. And it's cool because we can also see everything happening at the same time. If I were to do this in Ableton, I'd have to create a audio effect rack and then create 3 chains and then put an EQ or something on here that separates everything from low, mid to high. And then looking at everything, I can only see one at a time. So it's not too difficult to do within Ableton, but this is just kind of cool because it's all just set up for you. And then it even has everything to where you can add LFOs and all that. The only thing that I wish that this had is just more LFOs. Oh, and if you feel so inclined and you're like really bored, then you can just play Snake. Yump. Yump. Oh, I missed. Oh god, I suck at this game. So yeah, anyways, task at hand. Alright, so I covered this already, but we have our low band, which is everything below 250 Hertz. We have our mid band, everything 250 and 3K. And then our high band, which is everything over 3K. On the pre-effects, nothing is happening. And we can kind of talk about the lows first, which sounds like this. And generally within the lows, you don't want to do too much to it. So the only thing that I have going on is this is being kind of, I am closing the stereo on it, so it's more or less mono. It's not completely mono, but it is keep making sure that the phase doesn't move. And this little bar right here is cool because if the phase goes out, it will turn red, and that means that you'll probably run into issues if you're playing this back in mono. So the next thing that we have is our compressor, and that's kind of flattening everything out, creating a consistent sound within our sub. And then finally, this is a little tiny bit of movement off the low end that's just not really doing a whole lot. So it's not quite that important. So on here, we have our mid band, which has the most processing. And again, this is probably where I would try to do the most creative stuff. Starting off, we have a bandpass filter, which sounds like this. And then everything is kind of, again, everything is being automated through that single LFO. So that would be that. The ensemble is kind of like a chorus. It's really cool. Sounds great. That's introducing some stereo and almost, I don't know, it sounds awesome though. Then we have some distortion because we're cutting so much out of the middle. As you can tell, that kind of beefs it up quite a bit. Now the pitch shifter is kind of cool because I don't know exactly what it does, but it's almost like a granular resonator. And yeah, you can kind of read the thing at the bottom. I don't know why I ran my finger along the bottom. It's not like you can see my finger, but yeah. What it basically does is it allows you to kind of create some extra harmonics that are tonal within your source sound. So if you listen here, and I guess that it does that in a granular sense, although I don't really understand it to that point, but it's cool because it will give your middles or whatever you put a pitch shifter on some extra character. So then we have our all pass filter, which is our disperser. And you can't really tell what's happening, but if I change the amount and the pitch, then you'll start to see some cool differences. So, well, they'll be subtle, but listen. It's very, very subtle. We'll talk about the disperser when I get to it at the end of the chain, but yeah, that's just what I did. Obviously, if you can't tell what it's doing, then don't worry about putting it on. Then this is just taking out the lows and the highs and leaving the mids in the middle. There's not actually any boosting going on, it's just these two being brought down, and that's just for trying to control the middle here. Then finally we have, well, not finally, we have a couple more things. Next up we have a Foreman filter. This is really cool. It's kind of like a wow filter, but you just leave it where it is. I'll just kind of so it's really neat. A lot of times you can get the similar effect by automating or modulating a phaser, but it's cool that this is just built in and makes it sound neat. Next up we have our Knotch, which is the same LFO. Sounds like that. And then finally we have a bit crusher, and the bit crusher is awesome. If you want to make this more of a yoi dubsteppy thing, then you just turn the mix up and then turn the bit rate down. And then also you can tell that this kind of just destroys the sound, which is kind of cool. There we go. There we go. So if you want kind of like, you want to turn this more into a yoi type thing, then you can do that. but I am going to leave this on here, quantize that up, turn the bits up to maybe like there, and then I'm going to use the DAC instead of the ADCQ. Actually, turn that down. And then go here. And then again, this is just more so of a character thing that I'm applying this to. You don't actually need it, but yeah, oops. So finally, there we go. We have our high end, which we're doing more so stereo stuff to, as opposed to trying to overly creatively mix it. There's a little bit of reverb at the beginning. That's followed by some distortion. And then I'm just boosting the high end on this. And then we have some filtering that's kind of just sweeping up here to create even more movement. So it's a lot of complex filtering that's happening, but you can't really tell. I guess it's all kind of subtle until you put the whole thing together. So far, let me turn these off. We have our... And it doesn't sound like it's too crazy, but listen to the difference between this and this. So... It'll become even more apparent when we add our OTT and limiter, but yeah, so the next thing that I did was on the overall effects, I just turned down the lows just a little bit and then added some stereo on the high end, trying to make sure that this doesn't phase out. All right, so let's talk about the disperser. So it's kind of, if you can hear it, then great. If not, then don't worry about it. But what it's kind of doing is just alternating the phase. I think that it is a similar function to what happens when you shift the phase in something like Serum. So if I go here and I play this, listen to what happens when I move this. It almost sounds like the pitch is being messed with because the phase is turning. I think that's kind of what the disperser does in its own right, but it's a little bit different how it might go about that. But I really like how it shapes that character, and again, you can't really tell the difference unless if you sit down and listen to it for a good 10 minutes. This is also a really great way to shape percussion or kicks and snares and stuff, because it will help create more so of a transient or a pitch bend on that, which we'll talk about in a later video. But for now, that's just kind of on there. And again, if you're like, what does this do? Blah, then don't worry about it. It's not that big of a deal. So far we have this. And then I'm actually going to adjust the bit crusher a little bit more. There we go. That was just a little bit too much. And so now we have our OTT. Then we're going to make the sound a lot louder from our kilohertz limiter. So we have this to this, which is cool. You just turn the threshold down and then turn the gain up. I've also turned the release all the way up. And then the last thing that we're doing is the saturator is on, but it's only to use as a soft clipper. Then together with all that, we can kind of create some cool pitch bendy stuff. I don't know if you can hear it or not, but this is still just a little bit out of where I want it to be. Okay, I think that's better. All right, so that's pretty much the sound. Which is pretty freaking awesome, especially for the first patch that I've ever messed with on this. But some other cool things that we can do is we can, of course, change the filtering. We can do different envelope shapes with this. But one more thing that I want to introduce is the Unison. Now, there's Unison on these, and then there's Unison overall on the overall entire sound. So if you increase the Unison on here, then you are basically doubling the Unison on however many outputs or generators you have. So if we turn this up to like 7, it's going to create a really cool sound. Listen to this. CPU, please. So what I'm actually doing is using 21 voices on, sorry, 21 plus 7, or plus 6 rather. So 27 voices, because we also have the sub. So you multiply that times 7. Yeah, that's a lot. So that's a really cool thing that you can do. And then this would be great to do some more like bandpass movement too over the whole thing. But again, you have to be careful of like how much CPU that this is going to take out. But it's a great way to add in some variation for different kinds of hits. So it sounds pretty freaking awesome. And then you can of course mess with the detune and the spread and all that stuff. So I really like it. There's a lot of movement within it, and that is made possible by the, I guess, customization that you can do to not only Phaseplant but Multipass as well. And that's part of why I wanted to do some coverage over this stuff, is because it just makes the whole, or the entire design process so much easier. And even though I can't use, or even though I haven't used third-party plugins, there's so many effects that are available on here that it pretty much takes care of a lot of what I need as far as designing a sound like this. And it's really cool that I have a means to do that just within 2 plugins on its own right. Now, there is no OTT on Phaseplant or Multipass, so that is a thing, but you can of course download that from X4 Records and then put that in your processing chain before or after. But it's not to say that like, okay, gee, that's one effect. The only other effect that I might want is maybe a tube distortion, and that's just a setting on a distortion thing or whatever. But other than that, it kind of takes care of just about everything that you need in order to design a really cool sound. So I'm really excited to mix and match down the line of like using Phaseplant with my own stuff that I'm used to, but just as a means of seeing what this can do on its own within like Kilohearts plugins exclusively, it's pretty freaking awesome. The other stuff on here, don't really worry about. That's just me if I wanted to kind of add some more stereo and kind of put that into a mixing thing. But other than that, like, man, this is really freaking cool. Kilohearts, thank you guys so much for allowing me to do some coverage over your guys' stuff. I will definitely be doing more in the future, and I hope that for you guys, whoever's watching also enjoys this kind of content as well, because it shows you just how many different ways you can go about making cool sounds. I have gotten Final Cut, so I'm going to hopefully have some better editing and all that stuff, but it's going to take me a while to kind of figure that out, so give me some time. But other than that, I'll put this project up on Patreon, and happy producing.